let us learn about exceptions. An exception is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. When an exception occurs, the normal flow of the program is disrupted and the program or application terminates abnormally, which is not recommended. Therefore, these exceptions are to be handled. So we saw that exception is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. Normal case, we know that we compile the program. If there are any syntax error, we correct the errors and then the program goes to execution. And when the program is executing, if some abnormal condition arises, then the exception is generated. And if you don't handle the exception, the program gets stopped abruptly. That is why it is said that we have to handle the exception. So Java provides the mechanism for exception handling. So what is exception? Abnormal conditions or problems that arise during the execution of the program. So once you compile the program, you may think everything is okay, the program will run fine. But there are situations where there will be runtime errors and we can call them as exceptions. An exception can occur for many different reasons. Following are some scenarios where an exception occurs. A user has entered an invalid data. What the data expected is a particular type and an invalid data comes and the program cannot proceed with this type of data and an exception occurs. And second one, a file that needs to be opened cannot be found. You say that open the file and during the compilation it may think there is no problem. It is the file name is given in correct format and it is said to open the file. Okay, I will open it during execution. And at runtime when Java tries to open the file, it cannot see the file. Such a file does not exist. Then how can it open the file? So that is again an exception. A network connection has been lost in the middle of communication or the JVM has run out of memory. So network connection has lost memory. Memory is full. Such situations also cause exception. So some exception cases scenarios are listed. Some of these exceptions are caused by user error, others by programmer error, and others by physical resources that have failed in some manner. So all the three types of exceptions we say. First one we can say it belongs to the user error. Then user gives invalid data. Then the second one is a programmer error. Programmer did not take the necessary, did not ensure that the file exists. But still the programmer gave the file name and told to open the file but cannot be done. So that is a programmer error. And the third one is a resource error. So some resources are not sufficient or problem with the resources. So there are different types of exceptions that may arise. So there are exceptions are categorized into three different categories. One is the checked exception, second one is unchecked exceptions, third one is error. So first let us see what is checked exception. A checked exception is an exception that is checked or notified by the compiler at a compile time. These are also called as compile time exceptions. These exceptions cannot simply be ignored. The programmer should take care of these exceptions. So some type of exceptions which are notified during compile time. You know, during the compile time is program is not running. It is just checking whether everything is okay, whether this can be executed. So during that time itself, it notifies you about some exceptions. Then it is not exception that is arising, but it is compiler is notifying you about the exceptions. Such exceptions are called as checked exceptions. They cannot be ignored. Programmer should take care of handling these exceptions. That means he has to handle the exception. Compiler notifies that there will be an exception if you run this code. then the programmer will take care of those exceptions. Those exceptions are called checked exceptions. You can see the example. This is related to file. Public class file not found demo. Public static void main file. A file is equal to new file of e/file dot. File name is file dot text. File reader fr equal to new file reader of file. If you try to compile this program, you will get the following exception. And during compilation, you can see Java C. The program is compiled, and during the compilation itself, there comes the error unreported exception. File not found exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. That means when you write this main function, there is the chance for the file not found exception. There is the chance for file not found exception. So it must be caught or must be thrown. And we cannot for sure say that there is no file called file.txt. They may or there may not be the file. So if there is no such file, it will cause exception. If it causes exception, you have to handle the exception. So that notification is provided by the compiler. So next one is unchecked exception. An unchecked exception is an exception that occurs at the time of execution. These are also called as runtime exceptions. These include programming bugs such as logic errors or improper use of an API. Runtime exceptions are ignored at the time of compilation. So these are not notified earlier by the compiler. If the compiler notifies about the exception, it is a checked exception, and at that time itself, during compile time itself, we will take care of handling such exceptions. And there are some exceptions called unchecked exceptions, which are not notified by the compiler, which will arise only during, all the exceptions arise during runtime, but these unchecked exceptions are not notified also. Since it is not notified, you may not worry to handle such exceptions. You don't expect to such exceptions to arise, and you may not write any code to handle the exceptions. Such kind of exceptions are called unchecked exceptions, and it is not that for unchecked exception you do not handle the exceptions. Unchecked exception also, when the user is aware of unchecked exceptions, he will write the program in such a manner that such exceptions are also handled. So exception handling means you have to handle both unchecked and checked exception. I hope you understood the difference between unchecked exceptions and checked exceptions. All of them are exceptions only. What is exceptions? Exceptions or arise during runtime. When you run the program, some problem occurs, it is called exception. Those exceptions can be checked exceptions or unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions what? Those types of exceptions which we are aware of before going for runtime. That means during compilation, compiler will inform you about the exceptions, and you will write the code in such a manner that the exception is handled. Those are the checked exceptions. Unchecked exceptions are the exceptions which the compiler does not notify you. It may arise during runtime, but you are not notified. Even if you are not notified, a good programmer must write the program in such a manner that he has to catch all the type of exceptions. So unchecked exceptions also must be caught or handled. It must be handled. It is a type of exception. These are also called as runtime exceptions. For example, if you have declared an array of size 5 in your program and trying to call the sixth element of the array, then an array index out of bounds exception occurs. When such an exception occurs, what you can do? You have to handle the exception. So it is an unchecked exception because Such exceptions are notified earlier before running. Compiler will never tell you that this type of an exception may occur. It will not tell you, but you have to take care of it. You have to think ahead and handle all those things. So that is an unchecked. So this is the difference between unchecked exceptions and checked exceptions. You can see the example class unchecked underscore demo. Main method integer num array is equal to 1 2 3 4. Print line num of 5. There are only 4 elements and you are trying to access the 5th element. In this program, for the unchecked demo, it is written in such a manner that the programmer does not care about any exceptions. Is not bothered whether any exception may arise. But during compilation also it will not give say that you have to handle the exception. So that is why it is called as an unchecked exception. But when you run the program, exception will surely occur. What will be the problem? The exception object is thrown. Exception object is generated. Exception occurs means exception object is generated and the object is not handled in this program. So when the exception is not handled, what is done? It is handled by the default handler. Exception handling is done by the default handler. So when you run this program, what happens is the output will be like that: exception in thread main java.lang.array index out of bounds exception 5. That exceptions unchecked demo.main. So this is what happens with the unchecked exceptions when you do not handle the exception. Another type of exception is called as the errors. These are not actually exceptions at all, but problems that arise beyond the control of the user or the programmer. In the category earlier we saw that the third category is network connection error. What is JVM has run out of memory. In such cases, what will happen? You have to such type of problems are called errors. So the errors are typically ignored in your code because you can rarely do anything about an error. If a stack overflow occurs, error will arise. So these are called errors. So that also is categorized under exception, but it is said that it is not an exception. Errors versus exceptions. Error indicates serious problem that a reasonable application should not try to catch. Exception indicates conditions that a reasonable application might try to catch.